Well, hello and welcome to the first SMAANZ webinar for 2017. Thank you to everybody that is joining us. My name is Dr. Ashley Thompson. I'm a member of the SMAANZ board and we'll be hosting the webinar today. Now, I'll soon be handing over to our presenters who will lead you through the content. Now, before we get started, if you do have any technical issues or questions, please post and ask those questions and they'll be answered directly by Peter Downs, who's kindly providing the technical support for us today. Before we kick off into the webinar, I did just want to say a few words about SMAANZ and the webinar series that we're promoting and going on with now. Now, SMAANZ, or the Sport Management Association of Australia and New Zealand, is an academic association and it aims to encourage scholarly research in sport management. We also aim to provide platforms through which this information and the knowledge can be shared. We engage our annual or our membership through an annual conference, which is held in November of each year, and it's held in our locations around Australia and New Zealand. Now this year, the conference is going to be hosted by Griffith University on the sunny Gold Coast in Queensland. So we invite you to join us at the conference. For those of you that haven't seen, the call for papers is now out, and we encourage you to submit your abstract by the submission date of June the 12th. We also encourage you to connect with us via Twitter using the @SportScholars handle or the SMAANZ hashtag located on the slide here, or via LinkedIn. Now, a link to the membership information is also displayed here on the slide. Now, the purpose of the SMAANZ webinars is to engage with the SMAANZ community virtually in order to actually promote and encourage interactive scholarly inquiry related to relevant sport management issues, and to provide support for those of you participating to develop new knowledge and capabilities. Now, we have two streams that we'll be covering this year, building on from the success of last year's inaugural webinar. And the first one for this year, the one that you're joining us for today, is part of a new initiative. So the focus is on the translation of research into teaching. Now, the aim of this particular stream is to bridge the gap between research and teaching by considering different approaches to translating this research in a higher education context. Now, we're very interested in your thoughts, comments, and feedbacks regarding this new stream and this initiative. Our second stream is focused on core research, and this webinar will take place later this year in September. Today, our very first webinar for 2017 will be presented by two experts in the area of volunteer management in sports and events. And they are Professor Karen Smith from Victoria University in New Zealand and Dr. Pam Kappelides from the Trobe University in Australia. Now, if you have any questions at all throughout the presentation, please post them as you think of them. Now, we'll endeavour to ask the presenters questions midway through the webinar and at the end. So to ask a question, you simply click on the question text box, type your question and press send. Now, we would like to create an environment where we get to know the participants, so we will be using your name when I present that question to the presenters. Should you wish to remain anonymous, please just indicate that at the end of your question. At this point, I'll hand over to Karen and Pam to lead you through the presentation, and I'll join you again to assist with asking questions throughout. Now, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Karen and Pam for kindly presenting our first translation of research into teaching SMAANZ webinar, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing their presentation.
Tēnā koutou and hello from Wellington. My name is Karen Smith, and with Pam I'm going to be presenting the webinar today. We're going to try and do three things in the webinar. First of all, we'll do a brief exploration of some theory and practice around managing volunteer labour in the sports and event industry, and provide a little bit of research and insight about the nature and scope of volunteering. But as Ash has already said, the key focus of today's webinar is how this can be applied into a teaching environment. So we hope to provide you with an understanding of some of the practical implications, case studies and challenges you might face when delivering volunteer management subjects. So to start, we thought we'd better give you a bit of an introduction to who we are. I'm a Professor of Tourism Management at Victoria University Wellington here in New Zealand. My research focuses on volunteer management, particularly in sports events, festivals and tourism contexts, but I've also done work in a range of other sectors looking at volunteer management in the health sector and conservation, amongst others. I've written a number of publications looking at various aspects of managing volunteers in tourism and also event volunteering. Some of the projects that I've been recently involved in was an International Olympic Committee funded study with Leonie Lockstone-Binney, Kirsten Holmes and Richard Shipway, where we looked at the volunteering infrastructure legacy of the Olympic Games, focusing on Sydney 2000 and London 2012, and then also an investigation of the experiences and legacies of the Rugby World Cup volunteer programme from the Rugby World Cup 2011 with Jeff Dixon from AUT University. Like many of us, I have a busy life outside of my teaching and research, and one of my own volunteer roles is that I'm currently chair of Volunteering New Zealand. This is a non-profit organisation who exists to promote, support and advocate for an active volunteer in a range of different ways. And at the bottom right of your screen, you can see me smiling in the high-vis vest as I am the event director of the Thorndon Fair, which is a community fair, a one-day community fair that we run as a fundraiser for my children's primary school. I also deliver a range of professional development workshops for organisations including volunteer centres and such as the Cancer Society of New Zealand, including as part of their training for their Relay for Life coordinators. I'll be talking more about my teaching later on in the webinar, but as I'll say then, I teach volunteer management in events as part of two different courses. One, a final year elective undergraduate course for our Bachelor of Tourism Management students, and also as part of a postgraduate course on managing the tourism workforce. I'll now pass over to Pam, who's going to introduce herself.
Hello everyone and welcome to this fantastic seminar on volunteer management. As Karen said, my name is Pam Kappelides and I'm a lecturer in sport management here at the Trobe University in Melbourne. My specialist interest in volunteer management is around community development and working in particular with minority groups, and some of the current research projects that I'm involved are the most recent one is with the Commonwealth Games in 2018 at the Gold Coast, looking at the motivations and the human resource process that volunteers are undergoing whilst they're being selected to be part of the Commonwealth Games, which is quite an interesting project because then we're looking at following through the volunteers to see how they progressed, either being successful or unsuccessful volunteers. So quite a new project that I'm being involved with. Graham Cuskelly and a few others at Griffith University. A couple of other projects that I've been involved with that have given me some great research and insights into working with volunteers have been actually researching the area of volunteers with a disability and having them involved in volunteering. And I'll touch on that a little bit later down the track when we're looking at how to apply the research into practice. As Karen said, I have also had quite a few years involvement in working directly with volunteers. Previous to my academic career, I've actually worked in numerous roles in the area of volunteer management, recreation and sport management, event management, and in particular working again with minority groups. And this has given me some great translation of using what I learnt in practice into research and into then delivering the volunteer management subject for students to be able to understand how to put, I guess, theory into practice when working with volunteers. I'm also an active volunteer at my children's local hockey club and a board member of the Australian CAMS Association, and I currently also volunteer for the Riding for the Disabled in Viewbank. So I guess that's my background and what I currently do and why I'm so passionate about the area of volunteers. What Karen and I are going to be talking about has come from a great article that Pamela Wicker has written around a review of, I guess, what is happening in volunteer management, in particular perspectives on sport and looking at the individual, the institutional, multi-level and policy outcomes for volunteers. And I guess what we're looking at is I guess the research that Pamela has addressed and what is quite current, and how we have applied it or are going to apply it in our teaching area. Now, this particular piece of research is available currently on Advance in Sport Management Review, and is part of a process that Sport Management Review will be doing, where they'll be looking at reflective pieces around special issues that are relevant to the sport management area, which will be coming up in progressive issues of Sport Management Review. I guess most of you who are listening to this webinar, I'm assuming that you're quite au fait of working with volunteers or know the research of volunteers, but I'll give you a little bit of background about some issues that are overarching in sport, particularly in not only Australia, but probably Canada as well, and the UK. But we know that volunteers make substantial contributions to sustaining communities at many levels, from local communities to international organisations, through a number of different things. And we know that volunteers are the backbone of sport and recreation, particularly in Australia. And we know that about 1/3 of the Australian population has volunteered. So 5.2 million people have actually volunteered in Australia, which is a substantial amount of volunteers. But what we also are finding are that with this, we're having increasing complexity around volunteering, and we're finding that things like working with children checks, increased red tape to ensure that our participants are safe, are actually impacting on our volunteers and the work that they do. And we're also finding that through research that we are having perhaps insufficient numbers of people willing to volunteer, and we're finding that perhaps what we need to do is actually look at different ways of involving volunteers from the traditional ways that volunteers that we have known have been volunteering. So things like, how do we actually involve perhaps younger people in volunteering, which is really important if they're coming through the tertiary sector. How do we engage with people to be able to do things in a different way? So perhaps they can take things home to do, perhaps they can do things online, rather than the traditional turning up each week to our sport clubs and running programs. What we're also finding in sport are there are a couple of other overarching issues or other issues. So the continual churn of not having enough volunteers and having to retrain volunteers, which is something that sport organisations particularly are finding quite costly. And you can see there, I've got a couple of photos. One is one of a surf lifesaver, and we know in Australia that if we didn't have our surf lifesavers volunteering, we probably would have a lot more drownings and a lot more issues on our beaches. And the other photo there shows, you know, the different roles that volunteers play, and we know that those volunteers are quite crucial to our sports sector and recreation sector in particular Australia and across other parts of the world as well. So we're going to look at how we translate some of these social changes, some of these issues around training and policy development to ensure that our volunteers are actually engaged and are able to sustain our sports sector. I'll now pass it over to Karen, who's going to tell us a little bit about her area of volunteer and events.
And as Pam said, sports organisations face a range of challenges, and there's a trend across society for more episodic volunteering which is often short, maybe project-based experiences. One of the important things to realise is that this episodic volunteering commitment, volunteers can be encouraged to re-engage on an ongoing basis, and events are a really good example of this type of episodic volunteering. What we see, there are lots of different event sizes or scales, and involvement of management of volunteers in these has a lot in common, but there are also some differences as well. Research has looked at events across these different levels. So, for example, in a small-scale sporting event, often these smaller tournaments are often managed by the voluntary sports organisation and draw on those already volunteering in the sports clubs. Indeed, many of these events are often completely volunteer. As we start to look at larger scale events, maybe regular state or national championships, often this requires the host sporting organisation to go beyond their usual volunteers to look at or draw on others within the sporting community to help deliver. Those events that take place in a fixed location can build up a strong who they can focus on retaining year after year, building skills and loyalty. But those major sport mega events which move around the world are something else. And this is where a lot of the research attention has focused. These sporting events require a large temporary workforce. The volunteer program is typically a high profile and often oversubscribed. Now, a lot of the events sport volunteer has originated in sport management, such as Graham Cuskelly and Russell Hoy's work. But more recently, there's been a growth in studies published in the event management and leisure studies literatures. And for mega events, we also see these appearing in the tourism management literature. There is very little work from our sector published in voluntary sector journals or indeed in the wider management journals. And perhaps this is type of sport and seen somewhat different to the social services and others. If we look at the different themes of the current research, I use the figure on the right as part of my teaching to talk to students about some of the different steps in a volunteer's journey in relation to the event life cycle. But I can also talk about some of the areas where we see much research. Researchers focus on motivations, why people volunteer at sports events. We then have some research looking at some of that pre-event, particularly in some of the management areas around recruitment and selection. And then during the event, volunteering experiences. Post-event, we see some work looking at commitment and the retention of volunteers, particularly those who could be encouraged to volunteer again at a reoccurring or periodic event. What we're also seeing, though, is a focus now on looking beyond the individual's event, the impacts and legacies of event volunteering programs, particularly at major and mega sporting events. And I mentioned some of the work that I've recently done with colleagues looking at the volunteering infrastructure legacies of Olympic Games. The idea around this is often that we can encourage volunteers who are involved in one of these large-scale programs to re-volunteer and get involved in their communities in other ways, whether or not it's in further events, in sport or elsewhere. However, there seems to be, in the research that I've done, a lack of engagement with the wider community and voluntary sector, and sports volunteers can be encouraged to volunteer again in sport, but trying to translate that into wider impacts on the community seems to be much more challenging. Although we're not seeing much research published yet, there seems to be an increasing thinking around the ethics of sport volunteering. And I just include a couple of media images at the bottom right, looking at some of the headlines that came out of the Rio Olympics, looking at the challenges both of volunteering recruitment and conditions, but also things like volunteering attrition and the drop-off of volunteers to the Games. And I think this is an area where we'll see more discussion as we move on. I think this is a time when we're going to pause slightly, and I'm going to pass it over to Ash to see if there's any questions that we want to ask before we move on to talking about how we take this research into the teaching space.
Great. So this is just a timely sort of opportunity to remind everybody that if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please post them as you think of them. We don't have any that we've received at this stage related to the previous section's content, so we will move on now. But just a reminder, if you do have any questions at any stage, please just remember to post those through.
What we're going to do now is look at translating that research and practice on volunteer management into our teaching spaces. And to do that, we're actually going to look at two different approaches to how we can put volunteer management into the curriculum. Pam is going to start off by talking about the development of a dedicated unit or course, depending on what you call it in your particular institution, looking at a second-year undergraduate paper on volunteer management at La Trobe. I'm going to then come back and talk about how I've integrated volunteer management into other units and courses. One, a third-year paper called Applied Tourism Management, which focuses on events, and secondly, a postgraduate course looking at managing the tourism workforce, both taught here at Victoria University of Wellington.
Thanks, Karen. As Karen said, one of the benefits of working here at La Trobe is I've been able to engage and ensure that the subject of volunteer management has become a core for students in sport management, and particularly because I've been able to convince the powers that be that how important it is for current students who are studying sport management to be able to work and engage and understand the nuances, I guess, of working with volunteers. And in that subject, students are engaged in a workshop style format, so that what they're actually doing is I deliver the research and they do the readings around what is important in a particular section that we might be looking at. So it might be around retention, it might be around recruitment. And then what we do is we use that research and I ask students to use that to translate it into practice. So they might sit in a group and there's a couple of different things that they might do. They might come up with a recruitment package. They then present it to the rest of the group and we all give them feedback and we all work on it to work out, you know, what are the best approaches to recruiting people, particularly what the students quite like and I get really good feedback from is the practical aspect of the subject, where they are able to perhaps have me deliver the research, they then do some supported readings, and the readings that I do, that I have for the students come from current research that's out there, but then I also have prescribed previously for students the text from Kaskali, Hoy and Auld around volunteers in the sports sector. And that's working with volunteers in sport, theory and practice, and it allows students to have some background reading so that when they do come to the workshops, they are able to really understand the theory and how we can translate it into practice. So what you're seeing up on the screen at the moment are the actual aims and the outcomes of what students will actually be getting from the workshops. And you can see there that they're learning the contemporary concepts and approaches to volunteer management. They then apply them. They then practice them and I'll talk about that when I get to the next slide, where they actually use their assessment pieces, but also their ability to go out into industry and volunteer. So it gives them a whole perspective on volunteer management, not just the theory, but also applying it to practice, which I think is really important for students who, particularly in sport, and I know in Australia particularly, most of them will be working with volunteers in their entry-level jobs. So that to be able to approach and understand the sector is so important. The next slide and I guess what Karen and I are now going to talk to you about are the assessment pieces that the students actually do, because that's really important, because what they do is, again, they take the theory into practice. And so you can see there that one of the assessment pieces that students do on their own, and what I encourage them to do, is to use either a club or an organisation that they are part of or know of, or if they don't, I give them options. Because I'm also the practicum coordinator here at La Trobe, I'm able to use organisations to say, do you want some real life things put into practice that students can do for you for free. And we know that a lot of people working in the industry have limited time to develop resources around recruitment, around training workshops, manuals, policies. So it's a real opportunity for students to engage with an organisation and actually develop a project. So some of the examples there that I've put are, developing a volunteer recruitment package where a student will work with an organisation, will go in and interview the organisation, find out what their needs are, look at what the current research is saying, and then develop a package for them to actually roll out and use. That's been really rewarding for the students because particularly they can actually show what they've done as an outcome. It's quite interesting when they first start, they really struggle to get their head around that it's a practical piece and that they're working with an actual organisation. So they find that because it's so creative, it's quite different to what they've been used to in academic writing. So they have to get their head around that this is an application of putting the theory into practice. What I also ask them to do is they don't only just hand in to me their actual recruitment package or the training that they write for the organisation. They have to write 1 or 2 pages outlining why they developed it, what was the theory that supported the application of what they've come up with. And so that's a really nice way for me to see whether they've actually tied in the theory with the practice. And then what we also do is that the organisations then evaluate them as well, give them feedback on what worked and what didn't work. So it's a really progressive assignment for them to get some really good feedback on. Is another task that I ask them to work on in a group, and it's a really nice opportunity for the students to get together with a group and look at doing one of these 4 tasks. So I've developed a research project, an evaluation report, more a discussion paper around training and education, and then of course something around media, because we all know that the millennials particularly quite like the media.
Good evening, I'm Mitch Anderson and welcome to Wednesday's 7 Exclusive. Tonight's story is an insight into youth volunteering in Australia. We'll be investigating the current issues and barriers facing youth volunteers today. We'll also be looking at what motivates youth to volunteer and how to improve the current declining youth volunteer status in Australia. We were fortunate enough to follow 21-year-old Brent Ryan from Oak Park to the 2012 Park Life Music Festival. He gave us a fantastic insight into the current mindset of an experienced youth volunteer, and here's Scott Panunzio with the exclusive report.
Brent is an average 21-year-old male who enjoys playing sport and socialising with his mates. He is a current student who likes to use his spare time helping the community as a volunteer. I caught up with him into the lead up to his Park Life experience. Brent, how'd you get involved with volunteering?
So basically when I was younger, there's a lot of events in my community that I kind of put my hand up for, and kind of as I've gone on through uni, there's been a lot more bigger opportunities, and I've put my hand up and I'm really enjoying it. It's specific to my course and I get a lot out of it.
What are your past experiences volunteering?
Basically I started off at my grassroots football and cricket club to get a feel for how grassroots clubs do start and how important volunteers are. And then I stepped it up a little bit doing Relay for Life and the exercise triathlons, and it was good to see a bit more organising and some paid staff and working with them. And now Park Club, I suppose, it's probably the most major event I've done and I'm really looking forward to it.
How did you get involved with Park Life 2012?
Well, I do have a strong interest in music and I feel like this is a really good opportunity to meet others and socialise. And it is a major event, so I haven't had that experience before and I thought this would be a fantastic opportunity. And I mean, episodic volunteering, I suppose, it's a one-off, so it wasn't really a big commitment I had to do while studying, so I could fit it in, it was great.
Specifically, what do you want to achieve from Park Life 2012?
For myself, I suppose one of the main things going through uni is networking, and this is a fantastic opportunity to do so. I also feel as it's a major event, it's kind of hands-on, you see how they go about organising such an event.
Like we always do at this time, I go for mine, I get to shine. Now throw your hands up in the sky. I go for mine, I get to shine. Now throw your hands up
So I'm here with Kane, first time volunteer for Park Life 2012. Kane, how have you enjoyed your experience so far, mate?
Yeah, it's been a really positive experience. The event's been really organised and it's been run really well, which has been fantastic for me and all the other volunteers. And it's been a great chance to meet other people, other volunteers, and I've been able to make new friends, you know, through a really good social setting.
Why don't you think more people your age volunteer?
I think generally there's probably a perception that volunteering is probably a little bit too time consuming. For people like me who have to balance uni, work and volunteering, it's tough to find, you know, the right balance, considering I need to be paid to sort of make a living. So even though there's opportunities there, it's tough sometimes, and also I think there's probably a lack of awareness around the sort of scope of the events, and people would just need to find out more about, you know, the opportunities available.
So we're halfway through this year's event. You've had a good experience so far. Do you think you'll be back next year, and would you recommend it to your mates?
Yeah, sure. The experience this year has been fantastic. So I've got heaps of benefits out of working here, and for sure I'll be back next year. I do recommend it to my mates, of course. I think it's just been a fantastic experience, and they, you know, should get on board as well.
Park Life's wrapping up for another year. Brent, what are your thoughts on today?
Yeah, it's been great. I've met a lot of new helpful people, been able to listen to some great live music, experienced a large range of new tasks, develop some new contacts for the future, and bring on Park Life 2013.
But this particular assessment task asks students again to go out and use the theory into practice. So that's really important. That's something that they're able to then, again, go back, look at the research, look at what's out there. They go into organisations, because I ask them again to go to organisations and interview people, do a bit of an evaluation and see what the outcomes are for that organisation. The favourite option for the group project is the creative YouTube clip. But what I also ask the students there is, again, to, in their report, give a marketing plan and reasons why they actually could develop their video. So it's not just about going out there and running and developing a video, but it's about actually then saying why they came up with what they came up with. And one of the best outcomes that I get from the students are that they then put it up and they get lots of hits on YouTube to say, you know, they're promoting volunteering to youth, or they're promoting volunteering in a different avenue that they're interested in. So that's a really nice project that is time consuming and does take a bit of time for students, but there's some great outcomes for the students there. Task number 3 is getting students to actually go out and volunteer. It's surprising how many students in sport management that don't actually volunteer. They might do a little bit here and there, but the majority of them don't do a lot of volunteering. The other thing that I also do is I take them a little bit out of their comfort zone. So I might do something a little bit different to what they've already done. So if they're already volunteering for their sport club, I'll encourage them to volunteer for something like Relay for Life, which is an event that Karen actually trains coordinators for, which is very exciting. But you know, it's an event around raising money around research for cancer. So it's taking them out of their comfort zone and thinking about other options in volunteering. They're asked to volunteer up to 4 hours minimum, but they can volunteer longer if they choose to. I also ask, each year I partner with up to 4 organisations, and this year we're partnering with Relay for Life, the MS Mega Swim, Melbourne City Community Program and the Northern Blues Football Club Family Day. And what I ask is for a member of these organisations to actually come to one of the workshops, and they do two things. They tell the students about the events that they can be part of and volunteer for, and the second part is they also tell and explain to students what issues they encounter day to day working with volunteers. And so it gives them an opportunity to hear from people out in the industry who are currently working with volunteers. What are the current issues? What are we actually experiencing? And then they can actually then put those into practice. And then it also gives students the opportunity to decide which one they would like to volunteer for. Once they decide which organisation they volunteer for, we also have a student representative who then becomes the chairperson for that particular group, so either the Relay for Life, the MS Mega Swim, or Melbourne City or Northern Blues, and they correspond with that particular program manager or volunteer coordinator to ensure that their rosters are covered for the volunteers that are the student volunteers that are going out to those particular events. The great thing for the partners, and 3 of those 4 organisations have been doing, working with me and the students for the last 5 years, so that they find it really engaging to have young and youthful volunteers, but they also find it that they're guaranteed volunteers for their program, so it's a real benefit for those particular organisations, and they're all local to La Trobe University, so there's a real benefit. The other thing that the students do is then a reflection piece, and what I get them to do is to look at, before they volunteered, how were they feeling, what issues perhaps they had, were they apprehensive, were they excited, and then they come back after their experience and reflect on that as well and talk about what they encountered, what they gained from it. And some of the things that I get from students are that, even though they were out of their comfort zone, it's something that they probably would have never done previously, but now that they have, they probably will continue volunteering. So it's a really nice benefit for the students. So those particular assessment tasks are all linked to theory, but they're all linked to students going out and working with organisations. So it's really important that students are engaged both theoretically but also practically to be able to understand what it's like being a volunteer, so that when they are working with volunteers, they have that empathy, they have that understanding, they have that knowledge of working with volunteers. I will now pass over my next section to Karen, who's going to talk a little bit about teaching in her particular areas where it's not a dedicated course. So this is a particular dedicated course, but her area is more within other courses. So I'll let Karen talk on that more.
Thank you, Pam. I think some of you might be feeling a little bit like me that I'm very jealous of the opportunities Pam has to teach a dedicated course on volunteer management. I don't have that luxury of a standalone course. So the approach I've taken is to embed volunteer management within some non-specialist courses within our tourism management programs. I'm going to talk about 2 examples. I'll talk about a final year undergraduate course which focuses on event management, and then a postgraduate course which is open to tourism and other commerce and HR students looking at managing the tourism workforce. So if I focus first on our final year undergraduate course called Applied Tourism Management, this uses event management to look at the challenge of taking academic knowledge and applying it in practice. However, it's not a practical hands-on course. I've just put on the screen there 4 of the 6 course learning outcomes, which particularly relate to how I embed volunteer management into the course. Looking at the application of theory and best practice, looking at the idea of developing and critiquing creative and appropriate solutions to case-specific management problems, looking at communication of information and ideas, and also enabling students to work effectively, independently and collaboratively within a group. So in this course, I have 24 lectures, and I am able to dedicate only 2 to looking at different aspects of managing the event workforce. The first one introduces some theories and practice around managing the event workforce overall, including looking at the challenges of managing staff, including volunteers, in different types of events. And I draw on work such as by Claire Hanlon for this. In the second of the 2 lectures, I then focused on involving and managing event volunteers, looking at the roles of events volunteers can play in events, different reasons for involving volunteers in managing and running the events from the event organiser's perspective, and some of the management challenges that arise. I then use event management as part of one of the, an assessment with 2 parts in this course, and that's looking around evaluating students' ability to take a realistic management problem, in this case recruiting volunteers to an event, or for some students they look at recruiting sponsors to an event, and tackle this in a creative and appropriate manner. So I'd now like to dig into this a little bit more, just as Pam did with her example. And for this assignment, I select annual New Zealand sporting and cultural events. And I choose the events and I provide those to the students. These are events that I can get background information on the event provided to the students. Sometimes this is online, but also having done this assignment for a number of years, I've built up a sort of a historic a story about these events and their history, because otherwise you're slightly at the mercy of the event organisers, who seem to update their website and take off that crucial piece of information just as you're about to launch your assessment. This is important, I think, to use real events in this case, and you can see some of the examples of sporting events along the top and some of the cultural events along the right-hand side. However, I don't work directly with the event organiser in this case. These are events where students need to engage and take the role of the event organiser or event developer. They can make some educated assumptions around the events, and actually I say to them they should not contact the event organisers. I want them to focus on their ideas rather than just trumpeting what or repeating what the event organisers are doing. What's very important in this is that they use academic and practitioner resources on volunteer management to inform what they're going to be doing in their assessment, which is a presentation and then a reflection. I thought it would be useful to show you some of the examples of the kinds of best practice resources that I use. We have some great resources here in New Zealand, both within Sport New Zealand, but also the New Zealand Major Events, which is part of our Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And they have the New Zealand Major Events Resource Bank, where there is lots of useful information that students can access. We also have the VolunteerNet site, which is a matching site for volunteers and event organisers, and again they have some resources and tools for event organisers. I also make a lot of use of the resources that are available through Event Scotland, including you can download their Event Management A Practical Guide, which has a range of very valuable information on different aspects of event management. So students are assessed, first of all, through a 10-minute group presentation. I ask students to assume the role of the event organiser, to decide on the target audience from who they wish to recruit volunteers, and to try and persuade the rest of the class in acting as that audience to sign up as volunteers. And you can see from some of the images that I'll show on these next couple of slides that this is an assignment that really captures the attention of students. Many of them will come up dressed up in particular ways and will really engage in the assignment and really take on the role of the event organiser in trying to motivate us to join their event. I've also included some quotes on here from some work I did, a survey I did of students who are undertaking this assignment, and they highlighted the creativity and that this was something different compared to many of their other uni assignments, and that making you think like you were actually in the workforce and the realistic aspect was really important. I include 2 examples that I'll show you here. This was Open, and a group who used the New Zealand Open and really thought about how you tailor and design the event recruitment material around the idea of a love for the particular sport. And it focuses on different roles in presenting creativity and taking on that organisation role. It also highlights one of the challenges that we'll get onto in a moment about you doing this type of teaching, is that when I went on to the New Zealand Open website this year to think about using it again as a case study, unfortunately the event organisers had done a lot of work in focusing on their volunteer recruitment, and they now have an excellent short video that really, if the students press play, they'd have 3 minutes and their assignment will be done. So in this case, I've actually taken the New Zealand Open out of my events so that students have more flexibility to actually create and be creative in their own way. This is another example. This is not a sporting example, but this is from the Queenstown Winter Festival. And again, just I put it up here to demonstrate some of the creativity. A number of students have understood from the literature and the best practice that involving personal recruitment is really important. So actually having one of their students act as an ambassador of volunteer extraordinaire can be really engaging in terms of recruitment. Students then follow up this very practically focused presentation with an individual reflection where they reflect on their own group's proposal and presentation as well as others in their group in their tutorial class. And this is really important for them to actually move beyond just the presentation side, but to actually think about and reflect on what they've learned and what they can draw for other presentations. And finally, with this example, I think it's really important to recognise the creativity. So we always end the course with a bit of a celebration and a recognition of some of the outstanding examples, celebrating the successes and creativity that they've brought to their volunteer management presentations. And I'd like to just very briefly talk about the second course where I've embedded volunteer management. This is a postgraduate course looking at managing the tourism workforce. And for the majority of the course, we look at different aspects of work and employment in the tourism sector. In week 10 and 11, I then focused down on volunteers. And this is a slide that is a map of the world from the Charities Aid Foundation, which I use to start conversations and questions actually about what volunteering is, and particularly with an international group of international students, taking a global perspective and opening a conversation about volunteering around the world and in different societies is really important when you start to talk about volunteering, because although New Zealand and Australia have high numbers of volunteers, that's not the same case elsewhere. It also enables us to introduce Indigenous perspectives as well. So I talk about Mahi Aroha, Maori's perspectives on volunteering, and we talk about cultural obligations as part of volunteering as well. So in the following week, we then focus down on managing the event workforce. And while we do look across into the paid workforce as well, I bring both of these weeks together and the learning from weeks 1 to 10 into a case study, which I base on Prano Costa and Tadelbaum's paper in Sport Management Review from 2007, looking at volunteer management at the Midwest Classic, a tennis tournament. And I've used this for a number of years and have adapted it and developed it from those case study materials to actually get students to take the role of volunteer committee chairs, identify key issues and challenges in their area, and to come up with potential solutions, for example, a recruitment plan or a training plan. It also enables students to reflect back and think about how managing volunteers and paid staff can be both similar and different. So that's my two examples. I'm now going to pass back to Pam, who's going to pull together some of the challenges that we've experienced in teaching volunteer management before I think we're going to finish with a few questions. Thank you.
What I'm going to talk about a little bit about now are some of the challenges of teaching volunteer management across courses. And as Karen said, I am quite privileged to be able to have a dedicated subject within a course. But previously, it used to be part of a human resource management subject that I taught, and we used to do a couple of weeks, just like Karen does, of a couple of particular aspects around volunteer management. So what we found at that time was it was a little bit difficult to fit in all the issues around volunteer management within HRM. And so when you're actually looking at teaching volunteer management, what Karen and I try and do are pick the most recent and most, I guess, challenging issues around volunteer management and teach those in perhaps subjects that are not a dedicated course, to be able to give students some understanding around volunteer management if you're not able to actually teach it as a subject within a degree. The other challenges that both Karen and I have often faced is that it is a new concept, it is a new area for a lot of degrees and a lot of students. So it's one of those things that it is time consuming. It's interesting for the students to be able to take their time to learn the concepts rather than giving them lots of theory and not giving them enough time to use the theory into practice. So it does become time consuming, and also becomes time consuming for the students to do those assessments that Karen and I have talked about, because they are quite different. They can't do them the night before, which is what they often try to do, and we need to encourage them to use, you know, to go out and talk to organisations, be involved with organisations, and then come out with some of the theory. The other thing that I face at the moment is the subject has been opened up as an elective to lots of other degrees because of its relevance to other degrees within health sciences, education, and so I'm finding that some of my workshops are becoming too large, and being able to use the practical side of it with, you know, 100 or so students in a workshop has become quite tricky. So I've had to run bigger cohorts of students. The other thing from the flip side is that if you are looking at teaching volunteer management or teaching volunteer management at the moment, is I've had to work really hard with our insurance to ensure that students are covered when they're out doing their volunteering under our insurance, and we need to make sure that when we're partnering with organisations that, I guess, that volunteers, our student volunteers, aren't taken for granted, are looked after, are given the training that they require to fulfil their role. So there's some of the challenges that when you're running or teaching volunteer management to students that you might encounter, and I'm sure there are others, some of you out there who perhaps are already teaching volunteer management that can share some of those as well. We're now going to open it up to any questions that you might have, and I think Ash has got a couple of questions already, so we'll endeavour to answer those for you.
Brilliant. So thanks everybody for listening, and we do have a couple of questions for Karen and Pam. The first one has come in from Sam, so thank you for your question, Sam. They're just wondering if you both have some recent country statistics on New Zealand and Australian numbers of volunteers.
Karen here, I can start. There's a whole webinar we could do on how you can define and measure volunteering, but I'll try and give you a couple of statistics from New Zealand. The non-profit satellite account that was carried out, carried out in 2013 in New Zealand, had about 1.2, 1.3 million volunteers in New Zealand, going on to almost a third of the population. Once we try and look down into sport, it gets a little bit more challenging. There's a sector that's an activity group counted in that called culture and recreation, and in that it was estimated there were around about 30,000 full-time equivalent volunteers contributing almost 60 million hours. How that translates into individual bodies, well, Sport New Zealand talk about over 750,000 sports volunteers contributing over 50 million voluntary hours to sport in New Zealand, and I think that's a pretty good number to be talking about.
In regards to the Australian ABS statistics that were done in 2010, we haven't had any new statistics coming up, but we know that, I know from working in the sector and from the research that I've done, that it is on the increase. But about 1/3 of the Australian population aged 18 and over participated in volunteer work, so 5.2 million people. 1/3 of these, or just over 1.7 million people, volunteered for the sport and physical recreation sector. So that's quite a considerable number. It was actually the highest number of where we saw volunteers, and of that, more male volunteers volunteered in the sport and physical recreation organisations than females. So And we also found that a greater proportion of people who volunteered for sport and physical recreation organisations were aged between 35 and 44 and 45 and 54. So that's around the parent age group. So you're seeing a lot of parents who are volunteering at their local children's sport clubs and organisations. And again, as Karen said, quite a significant number of people who volunteered did so on more than 2 or 3 times a week, not just once a week. So that's quite significant. I hope that answers that question.
And then we have another question here from Katie, and Katie's asked, beyond teaching students how to follow what you've sort of termed best practice approaches to volunteer management, how do you think academics can work with sport organisations to ensure that research knowledge is then translated back into best practice approaches in sport organisations?
Good question, Katie, because we surely can't just focus on the students who come through our classroom to actually really kind of make an impact. I think some of the examples that both Pam and I have talked about how we kind of work more broadly within our communities are good examples of this. So both actually the academics and researchers themselves, as well as students going out into community organisations. And I think this is where often working with some of those sort of peak bodies or national or regional sporting organisations who can actually bring together a number of different clubs, a number of different sporting groups under a banner and actually working with them as a group, as well as going out there and doing individual pieces of work with individual sporting organisations. For example, I work with MBA students here at Victoria University to work with individual organisations on a particular management problem, and a number of those examples we've done are around issues around volunteer management in sporting organisations. So I think it's working with individual sporting clubs as well as some of those peak bodies, those national and regional sporting organisations.
Brilliant. So they are kind of the key questions that we've had from our audience thus far. So I'd like to take this opportunity now to thank you all for joining us for the first SMAANZ webinar for 2017, and of course for our first webinar in our translation of research into teaching stream of the series. We hope that you've enjoyed hearing from our 2 guest presenters today. Now, we also hope that you'd consider, if you're not already a SMAANZ member, perhaps attending a conference in the future or connecting with us via Twitter, LinkedIn, or becoming a SMAANZ member. Now, finally, following this webinar today, you will receive an email that just seeks your feedback regarding today's webinar, and it would be greatly appreciated if you are able to provide us with some feedback. Thanks again to Professor Karen Smith and Dr. Pam Kappelides for their presentation today. And of course, thank you to those of you who have attended this webinar. We appreciate your attention, the questions that were sent in, and look forward to you joining us for our next webinar later in the year.